Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting in 2018 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. I hope everyone had a good summer recess. Just to begin with, can I just inform members that Stuart McMillan MSP is joining us today as an observer. Now, the first item on our agenda is to take evidence on the UK Trade Bill from the Right Honourable George Hollingbraith MP, the Minister of State for Trade Policy, Suzanne Greaves, OBE Trade Bill Manager, Eleanor Weavis, who's the Head of Domestic Portfolio, and Rebecca Hackett, who's the Deputy Director Policy at the Scottish Office. Now, welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning. I understand it's the Minister's first visit to the Scottish Parliament, and he's at least seen the committee rooms and the lift on the way up, so hopefully he gets a chance to see a wider perspective of the building later. It's a fantastic place. Can I ask you, Minister, to make any brief opening remarks you may have?
If I may. Is it Chairman or Convener? Convener. Thank you very much indeed, sir. Well, I'm pleased to be here. It's fantastic to see the building. I've driven past it a number of times. My son is at Edinburgh University, so Pollock Court was just around the corner and saw it from a distance on many occasions. And I'm looking forward to supporting the committee's scrutiny of the Trade Bill. The bill continues to be a key element of our package of legislation to establish a fully functioning to be fully functioning for our international trade partners and individuals and businesses across the UK. The UK government wants all parts of the UK to support this bill. We've been very clear from the bill's introduction that elements of this legislation, namely in relation to clauses 1 and 2, do engage the legislative consent process. I note the Scottish Government's memorandum on the LCM from December 2017, and since then the UK Government has taken significant strides through its amendments to the Trade Bill that came forward at report stage, making improvements to the bill and answering many of the concerns that were raised in that memorandum. Despite these amendments, I do acknowledge that the current position of the Scottish Government is not to provide an LCM. I'd like to reiterate the Government's commitment to engage with the Scottish Government, and I remain confident that we will reach a position which this Parliament can support. I also welcome the Scottish Government's recent paper making its case for Scotland's role in future trade agreements. My officials will be discussing this with their Scottish counterparts later today. Importantly, the Trade Bill, of course, focuses on transitioning EU deals, not making future arrangements. However, I'd very much like to learn what the committee thinks are the most important parts of that paper for them. So, Convener, I look forward to hearing the committee's views on the Trade Bill and answering your questions over the course of today's session. I just add finally, sir, that I am relatively new into post. I will attempt in all cases to give the political steer that a minister should give, but on some of the technical detail of the bill, you'll, I hope, agree that referring some of the questions to my colleagues might actually give you better information.
Okay, I really appreciate that, Minister, and thank you very much for your opening remarks. Now, I need to get some things on the record, obviously, just for the purpose of making sure we cover all the detail. I recognise that some amendments have already been made, but given that a majority of members on this committee and the Scottish Parliament have already recommended that consent's not given to Section 12 powers in the EU Withdrawal Bill, and given some of the things you said about being confident to reaching agreement, why does the UK Government continuing to propose that the same restrictions apply effectively in the powers in clauses 1 and 2 of the Trade Bill?
Well, I think it's worth saying that we think it's actually quite unlikely that any of these powers will actually be necessary. I was discussing with officials a little earlier the sorts of circumstances in which we may find ourselves having to use the concurrent power to put in these areas to put something onto the statute book. And it is relatively difficult to see it. Now, that doesn't obviate the principle, and I completely understand that. But nevertheless, it seems to us quite unlikely that it will be used. As to the principle itself, as far as we are concerned, there are certain areas where the consistency of approach across the UK as a whole is the driving force that we must work with to make sure that when we transition any of these existing EU trade agreements, that approach is maintained. I hope that. I mean, it seems to me that there is room for negotiation, and that we are absolutely committed to carry on talking and cooperating and working with colleagues in the Scottish Parliament and officials to try and find our way through this. So when I say I'm confident, I believe there is plenty to talk about still and that we will achieve success, despite the principled objection.
Okay, well, obviously you think there may not be many changes, but the bill makes no provision at all for circumstances where the terms of existing trade agreements do change as a result of negotiations, particularly it might be initiated from third countries. And under current proposals, the devolved administrations won't be involved in these negotiations, which would be conducted by the UK alone. These
talking about future trade agreements
future no,
or continuity?
Continuity.
Okay.
Grandfather rights rollover.
Uh-huh.
Because that's the description effectively you provided in the beginning of
Quite
what
so.
the trade bill is about. If that was to happen, the potential that they could be prolonged and involve trade-offs. And obviously, in these circumstances, you might imagine that people in Scotland would have concerns of any impacts on the fishing industry, the seafood industry, etc. Now, the House of Commons International Trade Committee takes a slightly different view from the UK government, where they say our evidence strongly suggests that substantive changes will be necessary when EU trade arrangements are rolled over. The government should set out provisions for both extensive parliamentary scrutiny and enhanced involvement of the devolved administrations in situations where such situations and changes occur. The government must show what it is doing to foster a cross-departmental approach to the issue of rolling over trade and other trade-related agreements and fully involve the devolved administrations. So can you give us an update about what that involvement will look like, what progress is being made, and what discussions have already taken place, and what might happen in future?
So if we just address those comments at a fairly high, top level. First of all, clearly we made a large number of amendments to the trade bill, so that, for example, when the new version of the arrangement, whatever that is transitioned, New Clause 6, as proposed by Jonathan Ginogly, came forward and he said, look, we need to have a great deal more scrutiny upon this. And I looked at it carefully and the answer was, I think, yes, we did. What was agreed was that a report would be placed before Parliament that would describe the changes that would happen, that were occurring between the original EU agreement and that was going to be ratified by the UK. It would also describe, or in each of those cases, it would be very clear as to what those changes actually were, where they happened in the agreement and what their effect was. Any delegated legislation that was to be passed to enact those changes would, in its explanatory memorandum, point to exactly which bit of the report on the transitioned arrangement they would affect. This gives the Parliament very clear routes of scrutiny over this particular over any changes, and indeed the ability to object and to deal with them in the subsequent debates that will happen upon them. Furthermore, each of these will be subject to ratification, and of course the Parliament is capable of delaying that as well through the CRAG process. So we made some very real concessions, which I think have improved the bill, made it better. The sponsor of that particular clause, Jonathan Ginogly, agreed that we'd come to a better conclusion about how we would scrutinise these changes. And I think I'd just add on top of that, that of course it is our intention to alter these as little as possible. The whole point of the trade agreement continuity process is to make sure that we do have these agreements in place for exit day. And I would agree with your analysis. If we try and change too much, it will delay matters. There's absolutely no question about that. And therefore, colleagues should take some comfort from the fact that it's absolutely in the government's interest to ensure that this as little changes as possible, because speed is of the essence. I just wonder if colleagues wanted to add anything to that. No, happy enough. Okay.
Well, it may be that change doesn't happen very often, but it may. But also, if we take the evidence from the International Trade Committee of the House of Commons, there is a prospect that might happen on some occasions. You've described well, Minister, what the process is for the UK government and the UK Parliament. But what I'm not hearing is how the devolved institutions would be involved in that process, how they would be involved in any consultation, any discussions about these potential changes.
I might ask colleagues in a moment to describe how the access to those papers, but I think I'd be right in saying that they are available, as all parliamentary papers are, to anybody who wishes to access them. And as this is a reserved competence, I'm not entirely sure that there is a formal role, at least, for Scottish colleagues. Perhaps Eleanor just wants to fill in a little.
Yes, so at an official level, we engage with the devolved administrations on a regular basis. We have a number of forums for this, through which we update them on the trade agreement continuity work. So that will be the main forum at an official level, in which we would discuss any changes that might need to be made to ensure continuity. In addition to that, as the Minister referenced, the papers that we're going to lay before Parliament in advance of any SIs being laid would be freely available, and the Scottish Parliament would be free to review those as they wished.
So there'll be no formal process of consultation between the UK Government and the Scottish Government, or indeed the Scottish Parliament, if there are changes to these trade arrangements that already exist. Is that what there'll be no formal process?
So the process will be at an official level, as we have described. In addition, as the Minister referenced, this is a technical process. We are making technical changes to those trade agreements to ensure that they make sense in a bilateral context.
Can I also say, Convener, that all of these arrangements have been in place by definition, because we can't transition anything that isn't already on the books, have been in place for some time. They have been tried and tested. They have been ratified by Parliament. Their texts have been available for a long time. And I just re-emphasise one more time that it is absolutely not in our interests to vary these arrangements greatly. There may be opportunities in the future to renegotiate with partners as and when time allows and things are settled down. But continuity is all about giving certainty to our businesses, to consumers, to politicians, and anybody who needs to understand the process, that what we will have in place is pretty much exactly what we have in place now. So this process has already been gone through once in detail, and therefore it seems to us that a light touch approach, modifying as little as possible, putting this through Parliament, making sure everybody understands what has changed, which will be evident to anybody who wants to read the documents, is the right way forward here. If we were looking to change huge issues of ground principle in each of these, on any of these agreements, then a question might arise, but we absolutely do not intend to do that.
Well, I'm pressing you on that matter because, I mean, the International Trade Committee of the House of Commons has a different perspective to you. Others, I know around the table, have a different perspective, that changes may be required that are substantial. And if we're talking about systems that already exist, the Concordat between the UK Government and the Scottish Government states that the UK Government recognises that devolved administrations will have an interest in international policy making in relation to devolved matters, also and obligations touching on devolved matters that the UK may agree as a result of concluding international agreements. So the thrust of involving the devolved administrations is already part of the architecture. It may not be specifically part of the architecture of existing trade deals, but it's part of the architecture of agreements between the government and the UK and the Scottish Government. And I'm going to say I would be personally disappointed if there was no formal mechanism recognising that there's a role for the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament if and when any changes to trade arrangements were to be brought forward. I think that would be a weakness, not just for Scotland, but for the UK.
So I'm very happy to confirm to the committee that is noted, clearly. I'm absolutely clear also that as far as future trade arrangements are concerned, and you may well want to move on onto this in a separate section, so I shan't try and anticipate too much. But I'm absolutely clear that the devolved parliaments and assemblies should be very clearly involved. And I absolutely hear what you say as a matter of principle. I think our difference here is you take the word of the International Trade Committee about the fact that there will be substantial changes. I believe that there will not be substantial changes. I don't believe it's in our interest, and I believe time mitigates against it. And therefore, I think there will be little to discuss other than the fact what we largely had before is going to be had again, but with UK substituted for EU.
Okay. Is there we've got a supplementary here. Willie?
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister. It's just on the same point, if you don't mind. We already have an agreed concordat relating to the coordination of EU policies, and it's actually set out in the Memorandum of Understanding, and it says this quite clearly. The UK Government wishes to involve Scottish ministers as directly and fully as possible in decision-making on EU matters which touch on devolved areas, including policy formulation, negotiation and implementation, I say to you again, it's what you've just said a moment ago, not backtracking on that already.
I don't believe so. I mean, I'd just like Alan to elucidate a little on how we are fulfilling what is promised in that Concordat and memorandum. There are a large number of meetings have occurred on trade policy, on how we all work together on that. But I'd like Ellen, if she can, just to give the committee some view of how many meetings there have been and what we intend to do in the future.
So we have a number of mechanisms through which we're engaging the devolved administrations on our future trade policy, following a deep dive that we had with them before the summer. We have a series of that occur roughly monthly of technical policy roundtables to discuss UK trade policy in detail. And to enable the devolved administrations to feed in their views and expertise upstream in the policy development process. In addition to that, we have a six weekly senior officials meeting that reviews kind of the devolved administration's role in trade, in addition to kind of cross-cutting issues such as discussions on the bill. In addition to that, we and teams across Trade Policy Group engage with their counterparts in the Scottish Government on a regular basis. Indeed, after this meeting, we're having a series of meetings with the Scottish Government, both on their future role in trade agreements, but also on the upcoming consultations and how they can best feed into those.
But can you give any examples of how the devolved administrations have shaped the policy formulation, which perhaps you didn't propose initially? Could you give us any examples of that? I'm sure we can find some examples. Those would be at a technical policy level for the policy leads that work on the trade agreements themselves. So I'd need to return to the committee. But I know colleagues have had a number of very interesting discussions with our colleagues in the Scottish Government about the detailed policy that goes into forming a UK position for trade agreements.
We've got other supplementaries in this area. James?
Yeah. So just to give a kind of practical example and to explore what you're actually saying here, in terms of the locus of the Scottish Parliament and Scottish ministers, in Scotland there are 467,000 people who earn below the living wage. That's far too high. I think that'd be a view shared across the Parliament. And we would want to use any levers at our disposal to bring that figure down. So if new trade agreements were being set up in the future, and part of that trade agreement involved Scottish public bodies in purchasing goods or services, would there be a facility under the new trade agreement for the devolved administrations to mandate their own public bodies to pay the living wage?
Well, the provisions in the Trade Bill about the GPA sign us back up to the obligations we already have as members of the EU. And I'm very happy for officials to intervene if I misspeak. But in essence, that means that we have access, or British companies, Scottish companies, Welsh companies, Irish companies, Northern Irish companies have access to £1.3 trillion worth of international procurement opportunities. On the other hand, it also means that we are relatively limited in the way we can shape the procurement policy that we use at home. It has to be open, it has to be transparent, it has to be understandable, and it has to be accessible to all who come to use it. So I don't think I'm going to particularly comment on the individual example that you give, but if a particular policy was to be applied, it would have to be compliant with the rules around the GPA.
So are you then saying that in terms of devolved administrations, we're not able to exempt and apply a specific policy where Scottish public bodies are involved in procurement activities under a new trade agreement? Okay,
I think we're slightly talking at cross purposes. I'm concentrating on the provisions in the Trade Bill, and I'm absolutely clear that the procurement agreement will be the same as we have had. In essence, we will simply be individual single members ourselves, and I believe that Scottish institutions already have legislated for and made policy decisions about how they do that sort of procurement. But I think if colleagues have any further notes on that.
So it's obviously worth noting that we're, as a member of the EU, part of the government procurement agreement now, which we've signed up to, and sets the rules around procurement policies. And under the trade bill, we're going to continue our membership of that as an independent trading partner. So nothing is changing.
And just to readdress it, what perhaps is your question, which is in future trade arrangements, would Scottish authorities be able to take on a different role or different set of policies in how they procure whatever, and so on and so forth? I would say these agreements will be mandated, well, they will be agreed at a UK level, and therefore I would have thought that the policy in the free trade agreement as agreed at a UK level will apply to all public authorities across the UK.
So if the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish public bodies took a different view, the UK view would override that. Is that what you're saying?
I think it will entirely depend on, Eleanor, do stand in if you need to, but for example, in the EU-Japan free trade agreement that was recently signed, there was a whole chapter on the procurement from local authorities. Now, this may not be directly relevant, but just to give you a flavour, some local authorities had decided they did not want to be included in this and were not included in the free trade agreement, and some concluded that they did. Now, that's an example of where there are variations across the piece. It's a different country with different relationships, and it gives no great indications as to how we treat things here. But I think what I'm saying to you is that it will depend on the free trade agreement and how it is struck. The GPA is wholly separate from that, and we're just replicating. So if we're talking about procurement in general, we are replicating what the arrangement we already have with the EU, other than changing technical details and using the delegated powers where necessary to do accessions and people coming in and out of the arrangement. I think it will be pretty much as experienced previously.
Okay. Minister, some members inevitably will ask wider questions than just the trade bill, but I think we all understand that this bill is about rollover issues and grandfather rights, etc., and existing arrangements.
Understood.
So, Patrick, it's probably the right time to raise scrutiny issues at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning. Following on from some of that, and also picking up on the comments you made about changes in relation to parliamentary scrutiny. And it's right that this does cover the issues immediately in the trade bill, but also the longer term approach to trade policy and the UK government's commitment to work with the devolved administrations on both of those fronts, and in particular in your preparing for future trade policy document, it says you remain committed to working with the devolved administrations not only on your approach to the implementation of new trade agreements, but also as well as the role they will play in helping to shape the UK's future trade policy. There are two levels to this. One is about the extent to which the UK government will work with the devolved administrations, and the other is the extent to which parliamentary scrutiny is brought to bear on both levels of government. Would you agree that in general, what you're talking about, if we're going to be consistent with those commitments, is the idea that trade policy and some of the immediate decisions in relation to continuity and rollover and so on are shared responsibilities, and therefore that both governments have to have a mechanism by which they can decide and express clearly whether an agreement has been reached, whether an approach is agreed, and both parliaments have the ability to say no?
Okay. The Scotland Act 1998, it makes it pretty plain, I think, that conduct of international issues, particularly on trade, and specifically identified on trade, are reserved matters. So whilst there is absolutely no doubt that Scotland has an interest in trade and in promoting it and influencing UK government policy upon it, and that is quite right and proper, I don't think it has, according to the Scotland Act 98, and perhaps I should call Rebecca in here at some stage, a formal role where it can set trade policy for the UK. The UK is the body that does that. That's my understanding, and I'm happy to be contradicted.
No, indeed. I'm not saying that the devolved administrations set trade policy, but your position, the UK government's position, is that the devolved administrations will play a role in helping to shape the UK's future trade policy. So could you tell us what role that will be and how it will operate in practice?
Well, that is a matter, as we've already heard, there is extensive discussion at official level about the UK's trade policy as it emerges and as it evolves. With the devolved authorities, we absolutely take those discussions very seriously, and points that are made will be incorporated as appropriate into the policies which we bring forwards. It's also, of course, entirely proper for the Scottish Parliament to have debates on any issue which it wishes to, including trade policy. And I've no doubt that those would be noted in the UK Parliament as well. So there are many mechanisms there. And I absolutely confirm to you that it is the Department's clear intent and desire to take the concerns of the Scottish Government and the other devolved authorities extremely seriously on trade policy, because plainly there are very important industries in Scotland, very important issues which are clearly, it is clearly right that the UK Government takes into account. We'll continue the official level contacts as to be as deep and as long as they can, such that we do shape our overall trade policies such that it reflects the interests of the devolved authorities.
Can I just reflect to you some of the evidence that we've heard so far? Professor Rick Rawlings told us that the UK Government's new Board of Trade treats the devolved administrations just like any other stakeholder. This is very much a top-down approach which sends a negative set of messages. And the Scottish Government has said that the UK Government's approach to trade policy appears to place the interests and involvement of the devolved nations on a par with sectoral interests, and that approach must change. If that's the perception of the level of involvement and seriousness that's being taken to this, then we've got a problem and something has to change, right?
I'm afraid an impression it may be, it does not reflect the reality. We have talked, I would just reiterate the reply I gave earlier. There's been huge amounts of engagement with the Scottish Government and officials on trade policy. There will be a great deal more. We continue to evolve and think through our approach to trade policy and its relevance to devolved authorities and how we engage on that. And we are thinking very clearly about the devolved authorities' roles and how we bring the expertise that no doubt exists here, and working very closely with the Parliament to make sure that we exploit that expertise, get those views, and make sure they are incorporated into UK-wide policy. So the impression may be from one or two commentators that this is not happening. My impression from what I hear about the engagement is that it very definitely is.
Okay, so you don't see any need to change the approach that's been taken?
I think that the approach should always evolve, should always improve. We should always look to do things differently if it can create better results.
Small one.
Just finally, and this one does look further ahead to the longer term approach to the development of potential future trade agreements. One of the serious themes of evidence that we've heard is about democratic scrutiny of that process. And if we look at the level of democratic scrutiny that's existed in the European Parliament, which obviously will no longer apply if Brexit goes ahead, huge amount of public campaigning around concerns about the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. That was effective campaigning, and the European Parliament was able to reflect that and prevent the things that people were concerned about from happening. What level of democratic scrutiny, of parliamentary scrutiny, and I would talk about multiple parliaments here, is necessary to ensure that people power can have the same role in future? Does it involve Parliament signing off negotiating mandates, having scrutiny of draft texts, ultimately approving trade agreements rather than ministers doing that and reporting their decisions?
Well, just to re-emphasise, Kavina, that this remains this remains a UK competence, that it remains part of the royal prerogative is used to sign off these treaties, and there is no intention to change that position. As for democratic accountability, the ability of people to shape what free trade deals look like, the Secretary of State is extremely clear that one of the problems with TTIP was that it wasn't widely explained. There wasn't a huge amount of ability to address key interests, address key issues that people and the problems that people had with it, and that if we were going to have a system in this country, it was going to be much more widely accessible, that the public would be generally consulted, and we're in the middle one, just starting that off today here in Scotland, that we're going to run a 14-week consultation period when people from any walk of life, any background, any age, any part of the country can put in their views as to what we should be doing with the 4 potential free trade agreements that we are proposing to move forward with. We are also holding, as you know, lots of actual direct roundtables and consultation groups with people and regions across the country. And the whole reason I come to this is because people will be able to shape what they think, they will have much better knowledge of and shape the agreement before it becomes set down into a framework.
Forgive me, that's all nice to have, but will they be able to call on their MP to vote no if they feel that the outcome is not in their interests?
I think the honest answer to that is that the ratification process does provide for this change in 2010 for the CRAG process to be delayed, in fact indefinitely. So if there are very, very serious concerns about the shape of the free trade agreement and sufficient numbers of MPs agree, then yes, that can be achieved. But what we're looking for here is to produce an agreement that everybody can agree upon. And we are putting in place a mechanism by which we feel we can make sure that all the benefits of a free trade agreement are made plain, that people can feed in where they have concerns, that those can shape the actual framework around which we negotiate. We will report to the UK Parliament on a regular basis. We'll be reporting directly into the International Trade Committee as well. There will be regular parliamentary opportunities upon the free trade proposals. So we believe that there is a level of democratic accountability here where people can see what is going on, whilst at the same time retaining the UK government's ability to sign free trade agreements.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, and Tompkins?
So, I mean, just to pick up directly on that last point, Minister, if I may, when you say the CRAG arrangements, what you mean is the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, which placed what I think used to be called the Ponsonby Rule on a statutory footing, which significantly enhances the role of the United Kingdom Parliament, effectively to hold the United Kingdom government to account for what it agrees in any international agreement or treaty, not uniquely in trade agreements, and that's the ability that the UK Parliament has, as I think you just said, indefinitely to delay the ratification by the Crown of international instruments that the United Kingdom Parliament has problems with.
Indeed, I think that's also very clearly counterpoints with where the EU is moving on this, where Indeed. We now have competence at the EU. These are EU-only agreements from now on in pretty much investor protection arrangements. And therefore, what we are proposing here is certainly superior to that. If you compare it with the previous arrangements, I suppose ratification was an issue there as well, and it could be delayed, but now the EU is quite clearly moving towards something completely different. And so the UK arrangements, I think, provide opportunity for the input that we need to shape. They provide opportunity to scrutinise on a regular basis and see where we are with, in terms of the negotiations and how those are being changed. And at ratification, when we have a final agreement, we still have an opportunity to act, or parliamentarians still have an opportunity actually to infinitely delay the ratification of a treaty if they object sufficiently.
And in that process, in that very important process of parliamentary accountability of the United Kingdom government, Scotland, as such, is represented by the 59 MPs that
Indeed.
Scotland elects to the House of Commons. Because we are talking, as you've said a number of times, I think completely correctly, we are talking here about competences which are reserved to the United Kingdom Parliament.
Quite so, and it's just key to remember that that Scotland has its fair representation in there, and there have been any number of debates on all of these topics on which Scottish MPs have made their opinions very well known and looked after their sectoral interests, looked after their consumer interests, looked after their political interests, and told the UK Parliament precisely what they think. So, and indeed, many amendments were put forward and put down regularly by Scottish members of the UK Parliament. So, and as I'm sure you would expect, they are an effective group of people and highly successful campaigners. So I would trust them to be able to shape rules, regulations, shape FTAs in ways that suit Scotland.
Absolutely. It's been the very strongly expressed view of this committee, Minister, and it's certainly the view of my party, that BrExit can and must be delivered compatibly with the United Kingdom's devolution settlements. And that means, I think, that not only that devolved competence must be respected, but also that reserved competence must be respected. And that's also the view, I take it, of the United Kingdom government.
It certainly is.
Yeah. So there's no sense in which BrExit can somehow return the United Kingdom to a constitution that we had, before we joined the European Union in 1972, when there was no legislative devolution in Scotland or Wales.
Quite so, and I think it's just right to reflect at this particular stage that the Scottish Government will become responsible for a great deal more than it has been responsible before upon the moment of Brexit.
Indeed.
And whilst we can discuss Section 12 and the issues around that, large amounts of competence is going to be given to the Scottish Parliament that did not previously exist.
Yeah. I mean, that's the constitutional starting point. That we are talking here about reserved competence, and we're talking here about competences, therefore, in which Scotland's interests are represented principally by the 59 MPs that it elects to the House of Commons. But the United Kingdom government has consistently said, ever since the EU referendum, that in the management of this process, both the Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament will have roles to play in helping to shape policy and in helping to hold that policy-making process to account, notwithstanding the fact that we are talking about something which is essentially reserved to Westminster rather than devolved to this Parliament. That's correct, isn't it?
Absolutely. There is an absolute appetite at all stages in all of this to make sure that the settlement that was reached when the Scottish devolved powers were brought in 1998 are respected, and that as far as possible the devolved authorities must be brought with us as we reach this process reaches its conclusion. So to do so would, I think, just undoubtedly would create problems, would create difficulties, would create objections, and that must be dealt with.
You said, I think, in your opening remarks, Minister, that you'd only been in post for a matter of weeks, but within that time frame, how's that process going? What's your reflection, your immediate reflection on how the process of engagement with the Scottish Government is going? We've heard from your officials that there's very meaningful and very frequent engagement at official level. What about at ministerial level?
Well, one of the first, in fact, the first visit I did in my role was in one day to be in Leeds, but later in that day to be up here in Glasgow, meeting with Mr. McKay, sorry.
Derek Mackay. Yeah.
No,
Not Derek
it's Ivan McKee.
Oh, Ivan McKee, yeah.
So I do apologise, just a slight brain fade there. And so, yes, so I have been up here. I'm here again today. There's been any amount of engagement, as we've already discussed at some length, between officials. I actually believe that we can up the level of that, and there's more to do. We continue to think very carefully about how we deal with, how we negotiate with, how we work with and cooperate with colleagues in the Scottish Parliament. And I think we can make improvements to it, as I've already alluded to. There's more that can be done. We continue to think about how we can improve this process and how we can make it better and how we can reach agreement with colleagues as best we can. Perhaps, Rebecca, anybody else want to add anything more to that?
Well, just to refer to the fact that there, I suppose, in addition to the 59 MPs that Scotland has in Westminster in terms of the process of the UK government, you have the territorial secretaries of state who are representing the interests of the devolved nations as policy is made. So the Scotland office is actively involved in the process of developing the policy. Institutions that have been re-established, like the Board of Trade, you have the territorial secretaries of state participating in those meetings, and devolved businesses from devolved nations involved in those. But in addition to this, there is a review of intergovernmental relations underway. So the UK government is working with the devolved administrations to look at how the structures that we have can be reformed to respond to the new challenges post EU exit.
When might that review complete?
I think it's going on over the course of the year, so it's progressing with a view to further discussions later in the year, and then perhaps new arrangements being ready for EU exit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's been quite a useful look around the architecture of how the UK works in these issues. In our interim report on the EU Withdrawal Bill, we noted the Concordat on international relations. And I just want to see where this fits into this discussion we're having. Because that says quite clearly that it promises cooperation on exchanging information, formulating UK foreign policy, negotiating treaties and implementing treaty obligations. It also provides for ministers and officials of the devolved governments to form part of UK treaty negotiating teams and for apportioning any qualitative treaty obligations. Do you see a role for in that way in future for devolved administrations, and as is already laid out in the Concordat that already exists?
I think the answer to that, Irina, is I rule absolutely nothing out. It's clearly there in the document already. As part of the process that Rebecca was just outlining, all of these issues are being considered, and I don't think I can go any further than that at the moment.
Okay. Murdo, did you want to still cover GPA issues? When you can.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Minister, my colleague James Kelly touched on some of these procurement issues earlier, but I just wanted to follow up on a couple of points. Clause 1 of the bill deals with the power to implement the agreement on public procurement, which is a voluntary agreement between 19 WTO members, including the EU. But the bill doesn't appear to address the process via which the UK will become a signatory to the GPA, or the role, if there is a role, of the devolved administrations in such a process. Are you able to tell us a bit more about how that process will work in practice?
Actual application at WTO level?
Yeah.
That one I'm definitely going to refer to officials, if you don't mind, as long as we've got someone here who can respond. No, in which case, no, if you may, yeah. I think that will require a very precise answer. And if I may, we will write to you with a reply.
Okay, thank you. That's fine, Convener. Can I just ask one follow-up, just to put this in a little bit of context? And this is more about future trade policy than it is about what we're discussing today. But if you listen to some of the commentary around these issues, you'll often see it claimed that, for example, future trade policy will lead to the National Health Service in Scotland being sold off to American multinational companies, or we'll all be force-fed chlorinated chicken, which will then become part of the food chain. Can you give us some assurance as to whether these claims have any basis in fact?
It simply comes from the fact that the American market is different from the UK market. And I suspect that a great many people around this table have actually been to the United States and therefore have probably consumed products that have some of these items in them. The UK is absolutely clear that we will not be dropping our phytosanitary standards, we will not be dropping our food standards. These are things which we will not be negotiating away in any free trade deal. As to how it could be dealt with within a free trade deal itself, that will all be a matter for negotiation. There are offensive interests, there are defensive interests. If there are some things you refuse to accept, there are other things you may have to give, and all that in the end will come out in the wash. I think it's right that people express their concerns about free trade deals. I think it's right that if they have particular issues which they want included, they make those plain to us, and people should write to us and during the consultation go online and do that. At the same time, I think it's also right that we should seek to deal with any misinformation that's out there. And it is not true to say that any free trade deal will end up creating issues for the National Health Service. In all of the trade deals we strike, it's the right to shape public policy is absolutely clearly protected and will be so in the future, and we will not be signing any free trade deals that don't have that protection in it. It is right for government to be able to control how it provides healthcare for the nation, and investor-state dispute settlements and so on and so forth. Pushed to one side, the UK will not be signing agreements that allow the National Health Service to be challenged by foreign investors. Likewise, any of these sort of food issues, any of these can be dealt with in these agreements, and we've made very clear commitments about how we will deal with those issues.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you.
I can perhaps, if it might help, I can perhaps answer the question about the UK joining the GPA in its own right now. So as the Minister explained, this allows us to have access to a huge market for public procurement, and it's both in the UK's interest and indeed on the other members of the government procurement agreement for us to join. We very much want to join on the same terms as we are at the moment, and if the other members agree to that, and as I say, it's in their interest as well, then the agreement would be ratified, and Parliament would have an opportunity, if it wishes to do so, to consider that under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, which we referred to earlier.
Thank you. But just for the avoidance of doubt, this is simply the UK replacing its membership via the EU with direct membership, so there'll be no substantial change.
That is absolutely correct. Yes, okay. That's absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just ask whether that answered the question sufficiently that we don't need to write? I don't want to waste any official's time doing something that's not necessary. So if you're content with that answer...
Well, that's fine for me, Convener.
Well, I'm good. If you're content, I'm content.
Right, okay.
As usual. James, you still got any other issues on GPA? Right. In which case, we'll go to Emma and PGI issues.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming today. I'm interested in geographical indications of protected food and under the protected food scheme, a named food or drink will be given legal protection from bogus imitations. So in the UK, there's about 86 PGIs, and there's actually 18 for cheese, one for Orkney and one for Ayrshire Dunlop cheese, so we've got 2 in Scotland. The EU want to continue with the PGI status, and my understanding is that that's great, they want to continue, but that the UK government does not. So why not?
Okay, so I think I'm going to need that question fleshing out a little. So, plainly not trade bill issue, which I'm absolutely content with, Karina. I'm not saying it's not. GIs are a complex area. They present quite serious difficulties in free trade negotiations because some nations out there just regard them as unfair protection of non-tariff barriers to trade. Could you just explain for me a little what this is the EU has said about Ayrshire cheese and in what circumstance?
As far as I'm aware, that the EU is quite happy to continue to assign protected status for certain products. For instance, our Scotch beef, Scotch lamb, the welfare of our animals is different than maybe American beef. And I mean, you commented, I used to live in America and I stopped eating beef when I started looking after patients who presented with Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease. So I think when we're looking at the difference in the welfare of the products, we have great products, our beef, our lamb, and our Scotch salmon, and of course our whiskey. So the issue is, why can't we just make that a done deal and accept and protect the geographical indication status of our good provenance?
Okay, and again, please, official, this
I know this is not part of this bill, and I realise it might have to come back to us. But
we might do, but just my general impression is that as I said, some countries regard these as non-barrier and non-tariff barriers to trade. B, do we think they're important? Yes, we do. There is absolutely no question that the likes of Scotch whisky have to carry some sort of GI with them because they're easily counterfeited, they need to be protected. It's a very, very, very important export for the United Kingdom, let alone Scotland. And we believe that there are very clear areas of other interests, sectoral interests, where that also applies. Now, we also have to count, I just have to set that around a little bit and say that in most free trade deals, certainly ones I've looked at recently anyway, you have to demonstrate a certain level of penetration into market and or desire amongst consumers for that GI to gain protection. So on the whole, quite a few UK GIs which we promote fail that test when going to the Japanese market or, say, the South Korean market. Whiskey, no problem at all. Amazingly, blue and white Stilton actually quite often get through. But there are several others which you would like to protect that just don't have sufficient market penetration to warrant GI status in that market, and we come across that. So the GI issue is not a particularly straightforward one. I think if I can, I'd like someone just to have a quick word with you afterwards, if I may, just to get a slightly better feel for exactly what the question is, so we can answer it properly by replying letter, if that would suit you.
Sure, okay.
Yeah.
Alex, you've got issues around common frameworks?
Just wonder if after the summer recess, whether you could give us an update on how the common frameworks have been developing and how you feel they'll interact with trade negotiations, and if there's any timetable you were able to share with us either now or by correspondence.
This is definitely one. Yeah, this is definitely one for Rebecca, and I think also it's also, I think I'm right in saying, and please tell me if I'm wrong, I think the Secretary of State for Scotland is appearing in front of you tomorrow. It may be a question that is better directed there for a fuller answer, but I'm sure Rebecca can help a little.
Yes, I mean, I think essentially the frameworks negotiations are ongoing, and the deep dives that Eleanor referred to earlier and the discussions with the devolved administrations are forming part of that process. So I think there is a lot of intensive work underway, and the Secretary of State will be very happy to talk about the detail of that tomorrow.
I look forward to tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay. Do you have a supplementary there, Patrick?
No, I wanted to ask one last question at the end, if that's
okay,
possible.
No problem. I've got another couple of folk I need to get in anyway. Willie, I think you had areas of the Trade Remedies Authority, which I think is part of the bill.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks very much again, Convener. As you know, this body of individuals will be set up to look at issues involving trade and so on and so forth. But inevitably, Minister, they're bound to intersect in issues of devolved competence. It's bound to happen. How can you therefore ensure that the interests of all devolved administrations, not just Scotland, will be properly represented on that body?
Okay, this is an area where I have very firm views. It is absolutely essential that the Trade Remedies Authority is seen to be independent, to have no sectoral interest, to have no specific interest of any kind represented on its board. Why? Because those outside the system, those who are making representations to it, those who are demanding restitution from it, those who are trying to resist that restitution have to have absolute confidence that it is independent and does not reflect interest of any one sort at all, whether it's sectoral, whether it is country-based, whatever it is. Now, that does not mean to say that somebody from Scotland cannot be on the board. Of course they can. But what they have to be is somebody who takes an impartial view based upon the evidence from across the UK, because these are cross-UK measures. And I'm absolutely clear that we should be choosing people by merit on their interest in doing the job, because it will be hard and technical, in their ability and background that allows them to take the sorts of view and conduct the sort of analysis and understand the sort of evidence that they'll be presented with in a reasonable and rational fashion, preferably with a background in the area, but it is by no means required. But they are people who can take an absolutely clear view. If they cannot, we will not have trust in the authority. We will have dispute, we will have people petitioning, saying that the board that made the decision had narrower views in mind rather than the straightforward policy which government had set for the TRA to follow. So I'm absolutely clear that no narrow group or narrower group, should, whether it's a devolved authority and or a sectoral interest, should be directly represented of and chosen by a body to be on that board.
But will we at least ensure, though, that whoever is successful in being on the board does have knowledge, skills about the devolved administrations and the shared competencies that we have?
I think I'm reluctant to even go that far. I am not reluctant to say that the devolved authorities absolutely will be taking into views, sectoral interests, all of the technical data that is needed to make any of these judgments in a reasonable, rational, sensible and timely fashion will be taken in by the authority itself, not the board, but the chief executive and his or her staff. And that is the place for those interests to make their representations. The job of the board is to decide whether the decision that is being made is the correct one based on the evidence. The evidence itself, the evidence that all those interests, the devolved authorities and sectoral interests can provide, should be provided in as information to the authority upon which to base their judgment. Now, of course, on top of all of that, there sits the economic interest test. So that if, for whatever reason, a decision comes out that fits the various metrics and rubrics that are provided to the authority to calculate damages, to calculate the lesser duty rule and so on and so forth, but it looks like the decision produced by that metric is somewhat perverse, the economic interest test can look more closely about geographical weightings, about effects on particular communities, and it can modify and indeed annul or object the recommendation that goes up to the board. So geographic interests or devolved authority interests can play a part in the economic interest too, which should provide a second level of satisfaction of comfort that narrower geographical consequences of potential trade remedies that might be applied or indeed damage that's being caused will be properly represented.
So you could have people serving on that board who have an influence on about devolved issues and trade disputes, who themselves know nothing about the devolved competencies that they're dealing with and perhaps adjudicating on?
I suppose theoretically that's possible. I would suggest to you that the sorts of people who are sitting on this board, and I suspect the position in which they find themselves and the knowledge that they will require, suggests that they'll be only too well aware of devolved competencies and those sorts of issues because they are the sorts of people who will be recruiting to do that job. Will they formally be required to know those things? Possibly not. Are they extremely likely to have real appreciations of them and understanding of them? The very job they are doing will expose them to that day in, day out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. That was helpful. In terms of the establishment of the TRA, the Secretary of State, I think, said he's looking forward to working with the devolved administrations on the establishment and operation of the TRA to ensure their views and interests are taken into account. How are you going about that?
And again, there's been huge amounts of discussion with officials, I believe, and since Ellen is having the discussions largely, I'm going to defer to her to discuss a bit more detail.
Yeah, so it's my trade remedies colleagues who are having these discussions with the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments, and those are ongoing, about how the devolved administrations will be engaged throughout the trade remedies process itself.
Okay. I'll get a chance to ask Mike Russell just very shortly just what that really means.
Perhaps add something. Obviously, there's the trade bill actually sets up the Trade Remedies Authority and provides the governance structure, and of course that's about the efficient sort of operation of that body. There is also a separate piece of legislation, the Taxation Cross-Border Trade Bill, which sets out the framework under which the authority will operate, and that is where that is legislating for the economic interest test. And obviously, when the Trade Remedies Authority is looking at an investigation into any particular issue, it will want to consider what the impact of that is across the whole of the UK, and would want to investigate if there are any particular impacts in particular areas, including if that is in any of the devolved nations. And if there is, it will be looking to get evidence to that, so that when it comes to making the recommendation, it will take into account all of the factors that might influence wherever that might be in the UK.
Okay. Neil?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. There's a huge amount of concern out there amongst businesses, trade unions, about the possible impact of a no-deal Brexit, particularly the impact of a shortage of goods on manufacturers, suppliers and consumers. In that event, what are the types of goods that the UK government believes are likely to be a shortage of in the event of a no-deal Brexit? And are any of these likely to affect the Scottish economy disproportionately compared to the rest of the UK?
Convener, I think that the straightforward answer to that, these are questions that should be directed at DEXU, who are much more likely to be better positioned than I am to talk about that. We're talking about future trade policy. Now, a general comment I can make is that the government continues to negotiate to try and strike the future economic partnership, to create the withdrawal agreement. The Chequers deal, I believe, crucially solves the Northern Irish issue, which is by far and away the most difficult part of this entire arrangement to get right, and it solves it in the way the Prime Minister always suggested, which is it solves by through the future economic partnership and how that will work. That, of course, seeks to create frictionless borders and zero tariffs, which will answer the questions which you raise, in that the deal we seek is to do precisely, or to mitigate the issues that you identify. I believe that we will strike that deal. I believe it's in the interest of all the parties to do so. Yes, there remains a realistic possibility of a no-deal Brexit, but I continue to believe that much more likely is that both sides will come to this issue with pragmatic issues in mind about the potential consequences. We'll see that the future lies in a close partnership between the two countries, and we will see success.
I mean, okay, I know what you're saying about directing questions to DEXU, but obviously I'm here representing the UK government, so slightly disappointed with your answer there. Mike Russell, the Cabinet Secretary for Government Business and Constitutional Relations, who will be given evidence shortly, wrote to David Livington on earlier this week, saying we have serious concerns that a no-deal outcome will magnify massively the uncertainties over Brexit. The Scottish Government believes that there are major questions over a range of vital matters, including customer arrangements, burdens on business imports and exports of plasma products, medicines and medical devices, the involvement of UK universities in programmes such as Erasmus scheme, and the future funding for UK aid organisations. And he is asking, he would be grateful to know what arrangements the UK government will be making to ensure that the devolved administrations are consulted and their views made known in advance of this special cabinet meeting. Do you appreciate that letter was published earlier this week and not directed to you, but do you have any response to the concerns and issues that
I can only mirror what I said before, Camina. Clearly, there will be consequences of a no-deal Brexit. It is what we absolutely do not want to happen. I could reiterate what I said about my analysis of the chance of success, but I'm sorry that you were disappointed with my response to the previous question, but what you're talking about here, the consequences of the effects of a particular sectoral interests over a no-deal Brexit, is exactly what DEXU was set up to deal with, and it is absolutely their line of responsibility. And it is not proper for me, I don't think, to comment on those particular details because those are very much their province, and I'd be stepping over ministerial boundaries if I did so. It is perfectly reasonable for me to say that I don't think we will hit that position. Very much hope that we will not, and very much hope we will have a very close relationship. But I'm not about to enter into setting policy or making comments upon a portfolio held by a different department.
Okay, thank you, Minister, for coming along with your officials today. Sorry, apologies, Patrick, I forgot. There's one other supplementary. I do apologise.
One brief final question. You are presumably hoping that any outstanding differences in relation to the trade bill that you have with the Scottish Government will be resolved, that they will recommend consent to the bill to this Parliament, and that Parliament will vote for consent. If that doesn't happen and Parliament doesn't consent to this bill, does the UK Government intend to respect that decision and not impose legislation in devolved areas without the consent of Parliament?
I think the best I can say, Convener, is that we will work very, very hard to make sure that we get that legislative consent motion.
And will you respect the decision on consent made by this Parliament?
I'll just repeat my previous answer.
That's a no then.
Okay, well, thank you very much again for coming along this morning, Minister, with your officials. I hope you've enjoyed your first sojourn into the Scottish Parliament. I now suspend this meeting for 5 minutes to allow a changeover of witnesses. Well, colleagues, we'll now hear from our second panel of witnesses. Firstly, Michael Russell, the Cabinet Secretary for Government Business and Constitutional Relations, Francisca Morton, who's the Solicitor, and Stephen Sadler, who's the Head of the Trade Policy Team. I welcome our witnesses to our session this morning, and I will invite the Minister to make any opening remarks he wished to do.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for the invitation to start off the new session the way we finished the last session. I'm very pleased to be back at the committee. Let me reflect very briefly on the background to this and on the trade bill itself. The events on legislative consent for the Withdrawal Act have effectively overturned 19 years of constitutional convention and practice. The UK government sought this Parliament's consent and it was refused. The UK government proceeded with its legislation, ignoring that view. If the UK government believes it can proceed whatever the decision of this Parliament on consent, the Convention is of very little value in protecting this Parliament and the interests of this country. We're therefore seeking urgent discussions with the UK government on how to strengthen and protect the Sewel Convention, and of course we will discuss that next week. We'll also be looking for discussions with the other parties on how to respond to these developments. But in the meantime, we've made it clear we will not be bringing forward further legislative consent motions on Brexit bills. We will work with the UK government to develop this trade bill to ensure Scottish interests are protected as far as we can. But we cannot in all conscience invite the Parliament to consider the issue of consent legislation if the UK government reserves the right to set aside that view for all bills. The trade bill is designed to operate alongside other legislation to help ensure continuity in the UK's existing trade and investments arrangements with third countries by allowing steps to be taken to carry over or grandfather existing arrangements between the EU and third countries when the UK leaves the EU. The UK government has said in most cases the implementation of any obligations within existing international trade agreements will be dealt with through the EU Withdrawal Bill. The trade bill deals with those circumstances where that will not be possible and confers powers on the Scottish ministers and Parliament to do so in devolved areas in these cases. Our concerns about the bill as introduced were set out in a legislative consent memorandum last December. I'm pleased to say there have been some changes made. The bill will be considered in the House of Lords next week, and it is a better one than the one that was introduced. But we still have significant concerns in two areas set out in Derek Mackay's letter of 28th June to Liam Fox, which I believe members of the committee have seen. The first was a direct read-across to Section 12 and Schedules 2 and 3 of the EU Withdrawal Act, which gives Scottish ministers powers to make fixes to retained EU law. As things currently stand in the Trade Bill, as with the EU Withdrawal Act, Scottish ministers will have the power to amend direct retained EU legislation in areas that are otherwise devolved, but not where Section 12 UK framework regulations have been made by the UK government. Our other concern, and I know you've been discussing this already this morning, is in relation to the Trade Remedies Authority. The TRA will have an important role in the development of UK trade policy. It will undertake trade remedies investigations across the UK, which will inevitably touch on devolved areas or areas of significance to Scotland. Its decisions could have a substantial impact on businesses and consumers in Scotland, yet despite repeated representations from us and the Welsh Government, neither the Trade Bill nor Taxation Cross-Border Trade Bill provides a role for the devolved administrations, for example, in relation to the appointment of board members. We will continue to press for the bill to be amended to address these. The Trade Bill focuses on ensuring continuity through the rollover of existing arrangements. It does not deal, however, with the development of future trade arrangements. So let me conclude on that. Last week, Derek Mackay and I published a discussion paper on Scotland's role in the development of future UK trade arrangements. Focusing on the decision-making processes underpinning them, the paper makes an evidence-based case for an overhaul of existing arrangements for developing, scrutinising and agreeing trade deals. The arrangements for agreeing trade deals are already inadequate, out of date, and in need of a radical overhaul, even if the UK continues as a EU member state and member of the Customs Union. That inadequacy can be seen in both the currently limited role of the UK Parliament and of the devolved institutions, a point made often to this committee and at Westminster during the course of the trade bill. The need for change becomes even more urgent if the UK leaves the Customs Union and the single market. Leaving the EU will fundamentally change the nature of the UK as a state and impact on the UK's current constitutional arrangements. Much has changed in the last 40 years, both within the UK and internationally. The scope and nature of trade deals themselves has changed considerably, from an initial focus on a limited range of issues such as tariffs, quotas and cooperation, to encompass a far broader range of issues affecting a wide range of devolved interests, directly impacting on Scotland businesses and citizens. The development, conduct and content of future trade deals will therefore have very important implications for Scotland. The UK government has talked of trade deals that work for the whole of the UK, but Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland could have very different interests to the rest of the UK in some negotiations. Differences best addressed before reaching the negotiating table. The UK government's approach so far appears to place the interest and involvement of the devolved nations on a par with sectoral interests. That must change. We must have decision-making processes that recognise, respect and protect the economic and social interests of all 4 nations of the UK. Scotland wants to be a constructive partner to the other nations of the UK and a fair trading partner to countries around the world. To protect and promote Scotland's interests, the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament must have a guaranteed role in all stages of the formulation, negotiation, agreement and implementation of future trade deals. The paper is, however, a discussion paper. Where the paper describes what future involvement in trade deals might look like, we recognise that others, including members of this committee, will have a role in shaping proposals, and I look forward to that process.
Thank you, Minister, for these opening remarks. Before I ask my first series of questions, I just want to clarify, did you see any of the evidence previously?
I saw some of it.
Okay. You may have seen the beginning of the evidence-taking session in regard to how the current bill, trade bill, its clauses 1 and 2 replicates what was in section 12 of the EU Withdrawal Bill. I would like your reaction to what the Minister said in that regard, but also in regard to the fact that as far as existing trade arrangements are concerned, and any potential change in these trade arrangements initiated by third-party countries, no specific role being seen for either the Scottish Government or the Scottish Parliament in overseeing, providing scrutiny, consultation, etc. What's your reaction to that position?
Well, my reaction is one of surprise, given the commitment that already exists within the JMC process, indeed accepted by the Prime Minister, that there should be a review of the devolution arrangements, particularly the arrangements for consultation. I think everybody would accept that the weight of Brexit is too great for the current devolved settlement to bear. That's obvious. That's what's happened in the last 2 years. And no matter what position you took on it, the system has not worked. And therefore, there needs to be changes to the system. Now, if you take a rational, evidence-based approach to this, some of those changes would come in areas which have also changed substantially since devolution first took place. And those include trading arrangements. Trading arrangements, as I've indicated in my opening remark, were at one stage very much and solely about issues of tariffs and borders. Trading arrangements now respect the domestic requirements of nations. If you look at Scotland, we regard ourselves as a moderate progressive nation with a particular interest, for example, in environmental issues. We would bring those to the table in any of the considerations that we have. We think that there is a case to be made for substantial change, and I would make that case, and I would encourage people to discuss that case. And this is very much in parallel with what the Welsh Government put forward last year in terms of how they saw devolution requiring to change. I make no secret, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that I believe in independence. But if devolution remains the situation, the system under which we live, it is not adequate for the times, and it needs to change. And what we're doing is arguing a positive, constructive case for that change. We've published a paper for discussion. I think that should be seen as a positive issue. I'm not sure the Minister has had time to read that paper. I'm happy to debate the paper with him and to debate it with others.
Final question from me at this stage. As part of their initial evidence session, the UK Minister for Trade Policy also emphasised what he saw as the meaningful engagement between officials and Scottish Government officials, for example, in relation to the TRA. And he saw these as meaningful. What's your view of what these discussions have felt like, and how often have they been?
Well, I understand that the officials may meet each other today 4 times, but I don't think they've met each other for weeks, and there will be no future plans to meet. I have to say, I'm pretty critical presently of the nature of that engagement. I think some of that engagement across governments is meaningful and has worked well. The deep dive, for example, have been driven forward. But where I see essentially a tick box exercise going on, then I have an obligation to say there is a tick box exercise going on. In any case, the quality of that engagement is the key issue, not the regularity. And is there a willingness to listen to and discuss changes that are required and to fully express in the work we do what was meant to be and promised to be a partnership of equals? And I don't see that. I mean, the white paper is an indication of that. We went through a process in which we saw drafts of 5 chapters of the white paper. In fact, I only saw 4. Those drafts didn't bear a great relation to what eventually was in the white paper. But I did sit at a ministerial meeting at which 2 UK ministers read out the précis of a couple of those drafts because we as ministers and people around the table were not allowed to see them. I don't call the quality of that to be high. I felt as I was sitting in a monastery being read at while things went around me. That's not a quality of representation. Now, to be fair, I doubt whether those 2 ministers had themselves seen the white paper. And I think part of this is a culture of extreme centralisation in the current UK government and a culture of extreme chaos. But I don't believe the quality of engagement is presently meaningful.
Okay, Adam Tompkins.
Thanks, Convener. Minister, it won't surprise you to know that I want to get into the issues in a bit more detail today that were raised by me and yesterday in the Chamber, which you chose not to respond to on that occasion. This time last year, you and I were agreed that Brexit can and must be delivered compatibly with the United Kingdom's devolution settlements. Why do you no longer hold to that view? Why is it now your view that the United Kingdom's devolution settlements need to be changed, which is what you've just told us, in order to bear the weight of Brexit?
Well, they're not mutually incompatible positions. I believe that the current devolved settlement needs to be observed. But I do believe it is possible also to say that there are parts of that that need to be improved because they don't work. An example is the Sewel Convention. The Sewel Convention is shown not to work. We've seen that in recent months. Consent means consent, even if we say it isn't consent. So in those circumstances, there needs to be a change. But of course, what is happening at the present moment has to be delivered according to the current settlement, but we can envisage a better settlement. So it is, if I may finish, it is a dynamic work in progress.
Under the current settlement, international relations, international treaties and international trade are reserved to the United Kingdom Parliament, aren't they?
They are reserved, but of course there is an operation, a way in which they have operated has tended to be much more relaxed than the definition that you're giving. And of course, the definition that was given by the Advocate General in the Supreme Court case was quite a considerable narrowing of that definition. And I think it's right for us to point out that that is a worrying development. It's been pointed out by the other devolved administrations as well.
So you accept that international trade is a reserved competence in which Scotland's interests are represented by 59 MPs that Scotland elects to Westminster?
No, I accept that the devolution process is one that is dynamic and has continued to change. I do not accept there is a hierarchy of governments. That's as we exist within the devolution settlement. And I think because there are responsibilities that the devolved administrations have, they should be represented in trade talks. That's the position I'm taking. Richard Keane's position on the international obligations will be tested in the Supreme Court, and the judgment of the Supreme Court will say something. I
don't think it's wise for us to speculate on the record about what the Supreme Court might say in a case which is live before it. So I'm not going to accept the invitation to reflect on arguments that were put before an independent judicial body, Minister, if that's all right with you. The point, though, is this: that in your paper published last week or the week before, jointly with Mr Mackay, you have proposed that Scottish ministers should have an effective veto in every stage of the preparation, negotiation, mandating, ratification and signing of future trade agreements for all future trade agreements, notwithstanding the fact that these are reserved competences. How is that standing up for the devolution settlement, which you and I were agreed 12 months ago needed to be done throughout the Brexit process?
The reason I didn't respond to this yesterday is because I wanted to have the opportunity to do so properly in this debate. So thank you for raising it, because it's the point you raised yesterday. The only veto that exists in the devolution settlement is that from the UK government. There is no other veto. because in the devolution settlement, the actions of any devolved administration can be vetoed by the UK government. There is no means by which, either in this paper or in anything that exists or anticipated under devolution, that we could veto the decisions of the UK government. So that is regrettably a mistaken impression you have, and I'm glad to be able to correct it. The reality of the situation is that in this paper we do suggest there are areas in which it would be important to have the agreement of the Scottish Government. Just as to take a...
I'm sorry, but you don't say important. You say important. You say agreement required.
Yes,
you have listed in Annex B on page 62 of your paper 5 instances where the agreement of not only the Scottish Government but also the Scottish Parliament will be required in your view, for a future trade agreement to be even prepared, never mind negotiated, never mind ratified or signed. Now, you know, agreement required is the definition of a veto, because if the agreement is then not given, there is an effective veto.
Well, no, that would only be the case.
Or required doesn't mean required.
This is not a debate, folks, so let's get this questions and answers, please.
That would only be the case if that agreement was withheld, if it was withheld for good reasons, and that withholding agreement was final. It would not be final in these circumstances. But you treat agreement as something that's confrontational. I would treat agreement as being something that we would seek to find, because we have and continue to seek to find agreement. And it's not unreasonable to say that, for example, on matters of agriculture, where that is within a trade deal, that the devolved administrations, which have responsibility for agriculture, should be involved in that process and should agree to that process. The issue, I think it was Emma Harper who raised it earlier, but it's taken 20 minutes or so to bring it in here. The issue of chlorinated chicken refers. The issue of hormone-fed beef refers. There are circumstances in which we would not agree to those. Now, in the end, the UK could, and as Scotland is independent, the UK could impose that. But seeking agreement would be the thing that you would do to sit down and negotiate. I know the current UK government is incapable of negotiating agreement, but we're not incapable of negotiating agreement, and I'm quite sure that that could be found. I don't think it's at all unreasonable. But in addition, this is a discussion paper. You may say that you would want to change the word required, say agreement would be sought. That would be good, because then the UK government would be able to seek agreement for matters that were our responsibility. Perhaps that's the change you would like to see in the paper.
Well, I welcome those remarks, Minister, because those remarks are much more conciliatory than the very angry tone that you've taken in the paper that you published a week ago. You don't talk in that paper about the United Kingdom government seeking your agreement. You talk about the United Kingdom being required not to proceed with reserved competence unless and until it first has your agreement, and that is a very different set of issues. But the point remains this. A year ago, you were all for defending the devolution settlement, and we supported you in that. Now you've changed your tune and you want to attack the devolution settlement because you don't believe that international trade should remain a reserved competence. Isn't that the long and the short of it?
It's not a great surprise to anybody here that I would prefer independence to devolution. But I think putting forward constructive proposals to develop the devolution settlement in the light of the chaos that we have seen and the difficulties that Brexit has created for devolution should be seen as a constructive act. Because what we're trying to do is to say devolution does not work. And my goodness me, I think the evidence of that is all around. So what we're trying to say is there's different ways to do this. Now, I mean, I have read this paper and reread this paper and even edited this paper. I don't think it's angry in any place. What it is trying to put forward a constructive set of proposals to improve devolution. There are those who would attack me for doing so because I would be expected only to talk about independence. So I seem to be caught between a rock and a hard place here. But I do think this debate is a useful one to have. The Welsh are having it, we're having it. I don't think it's inconsistent to defend what exists now, but to say it could be improved, that would seem to be rational.
Patrick Harvey.
Good morning. What the Scottish Government has said is that the devolved institutions, stress institutions, government as well as Parliament, must play an enhanced role in the development of future trade policy. That's actually very similar to what the UK government has said in its paper on future trade policy, that there must be a role for the devolved institutions. Is there a way of framing that in a clear, comprehensible manner that allows decision-making, that recognises that this is an area of shared responsibility where cooperation and compromise will be needed on both sides, and where each institution has the ability to determine whether sufficient compromise has been reached without getting into the kind of dynamic that we've just seen where people are angrily counting the number of vetoes.
Yes, and there's an example that you could use. You could use the example of the Canadian Trade Treaty, and you could use the example of the federal, the provinces in Canada being involved in that negotiation and having to be at the table because the negotiation is about responsibilities that they have. There seem to be two examples that are taken from the Canadian experience. That's the positive example, where you can in actual have the range of provinces with the federal government sitting there discussing this with the EU and coming to a conclusion. The negative take has been the UK government's take, which is terrified of what happened at the ratification stage with the Wallonia Parliament saying that they had reservations, which was perfectly natural and which was overcome. So I think there's an example before us that you can move in that direction and have that work. Now, you would need a willingness to do so. We've put on the table some ideas to do so. If there are other ideas about how that can be refined, we're very open to those ideas.
You've also given a fairly clear indication that you favour more parliamentary scrutiny in general, not just in relation to the devolved institutions. For example, in maintaining to some extent, perhaps even building on the level of parliamentary scrutiny that's operated in the European Parliament, which won't operate under the UK government's plans in the UK Parliament. Is it reasonable then for us to assume that in whatever level of engagement there exists between the UK government and the Scottish government will persistently seek the agreement of the Scottish Parliament for the decisions that it takes in relation to those discussions?
Yes.
What's the mechanism for us to ensure that that happens?
Well, I think that's within the paper. There's some discussion of what that mechanism should be, but I would have thought that there would be stages in the process in which we would seek parliamentary agreement or authority. There would also be committee scrutiny, which actually would be a pretty powerful part of it. I mean, trade deals by definition are complex, and therefore you would want to make sure that the decision-making process was on the principles that were applied, not necessarily on every sub-paragraph. But committee scrutiny would be important, parliamentary scrutiny would be important, and parliamentary decision-making would be important.
So if, for example, a UK government doesn't agree that the Scottish government should be able to have to agree or disagree to a negotiating mandate for a future trade agreement, but is willing to discuss that mandate with the Scottish government will also be able to discuss it with the Scottish Parliament, will not be inhibited from discussing that with the Scottish Parliament and seeking parliamentary approval for its approach.
No, I agree. I think that would be the right way to do it. And of course, we've shown that example in what we did on the Continuity Bill, which was very much a product of discussion and debate. And indeed, that bill was developed as it went through Parliament because there was a willingness to do so. So, I mean, I think that's exactly where I'd find myself.
And just finally, in relation to the shorter term issues within the trade bill, in terms of if BrExit is done and the desire to have continuity of existing arrangements, a great emphasis from the previous session from the UK Minister was that there will be no substantial or very few substantial changes. Is there any discussion that's taken place between the two governments about the scenario in which the UK government thinks that a change is not substantial, but the Scottish government thinks that it is substantial, and how that difference would be resolved?
No, there hasn't been that discussion, and I think it's a topic that needs to be addressed. But as usual, the present structures would seem to me to find it very difficult to resolve those, because at the end of the day, the UK government makes those decisions. You know, the UK government definitions, it's like the definition of the word consent. It is defined by the UK government.
So we have no confidence
No,
then
I don't.
That the UK government's commitment that there will be no substantial or significant changes, you don't believe that?
No, I have very little confidence in that, I'm afraid to say. I mean, I'm being straight about that.
Okay.
Alexander, Common Frameworks.
I just wondered if Cabinet Secretary would like to give us an update maybe after summer of any progress that's been made in his contribution to the Common Frameworks.
Well, I know that officials answered this with the Trade Minister, and he they referred to the discussion of the Secretary of State. From our side, the deep dives have continued. There have been no Section 12 orders as yet, which I regard as a positive step. And, we continue to discuss the areas where we think that we can work together. I do not believe that Section 12 orders are the right things to do. And therefore, if we can find ways to establish those frameworks without Section 12 orders, we've made it absolutely clear that we will do so. And that work is continuing. And we have not reached an impasse as yet on any of those.
Thank you.
Just an addition about common frameworks. I mean, we have unique differences we have our fishing and our agriculture in Scotland. And so Scotland needs to have the ability to contribute quite effectively into trade negotiations when we're talking about common frameworks and further, I guess, agricultural aspects. So how can we be assured that we have the ability to communicate effectively what the unique issues are with the requirements for common frameworks moving forward?
The outcome of a common framework in the areas where they think will be required may or may not be legislative. That's clearly been the debate up until now. If you look at agriculture, there is progress being made on an agriculture bill, the BrExit agricultural bill, and therefore the issue you're addressing is germane to that. Is that discussion on the UK agriculture bill making progress in understanding that? Now, so far so good. That discussion continues. When it is at its conclusion and a bill is published, we will see whether that discussion has produced the correct fruit or not. I'm not sure it's a complete agricultural term, but that's what we're looking for to find out. So far, that discussion continues. That's the product of the deep dives. It is also the product of ensuring that there's continuing dialogue on those matters. If we got to the stage where there was a Section 12 order or a bill, which essentially took powers that it should not take, that would be the hard moment. We're not at that moment as yet, but it takes a lot of work from a lot of people to make that happen.
And we need to make sure that the frameworks are agreed and not imposed on Scotland. Isn't that one of the
That's
key
exactly
aspects?
the thing, and it's the outcomes of that that are important. For example, an agricultural bill that can be agreed and recognises the roles of the devolved administrations and does not impinge upon those. That's vital.
Okay, thanks.
What about areas to do with PGA?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I don't know if you saw the previous exchange I had with the UK Trade Minister around GPA. I don't know if you have any specific concerns around GPA. My understanding of what Mr Hollingbury said to us was all that's happening here is that the UK, which is currently part of the GPA through the EU, is replacing that with direct involvement. Is that something the Scottish Government are content with as an approach?
Well, yes, we are already in the GPA because we're a member through the EU. I've met last year with officials involved with the GPA, and they were starting that process of making the transfer. I was slightly concerned with one of the answers you got from an official, which seemed to imply that the trade opportunities, the opportunities to bid for public procurement contracts would be something new. They're not new. They already exist under the EU, and indeed the official admitted to you that they are seeking to replicate the UK terms. So the EU terms, there would be no difference in that regard. It does seem a lot of work, however, is going to be required on both sides to get to where they already are. But the opportunities that the GPA present to businesses within this country will not change, providing they're able to secure the same terms, and that's not guaranteed. So one does wonder why this is going on.
Okay, and just to put the same question to you that I put to Mr Hollingbury around procurement issues, we've heard various claims being made that future trade deals will open up the NHS in Scotland to bids from American companies, and we're all going to be force-fed chlorinated chicken, and that will be part of the food chain. And we heard very clearly from the UK Trade Minister that this is nonsense, and that's not going to happen. Do you accept that?
No. I don't accept
So he's not telling the truth?
No, I'm not saying he's not telling the truth. He may, as an individual, be telling you exactly what he believes to be true. I believe the system that will come into place will make it considerably easier in terms of trading for those things to happen. Because the people who are influencing this, and they will be politicians such as ourselves, there are many of those whose interests lie in ensuring those things do happen. It is also in the interest of the countries that are seeking the trade deals to push what they want to happen. And I fear that the expertise in the UK in trade deals will be considerably lessened by not being in the EU, and the weight available in those trade deals will be considerably lessened. And that's a big issue. You know, trade is not solely about the biggest stick, but sometimes it is about the biggest stick. And having that debate doesn't mean, you know, say we will not have chlorinated chicken. The weight against that from the United States, which has not been behaving exactly, you know, charmingly in these matters in recent times, will be great. So I do not accept the assertions, not because I doubt his word, but because I think the whole system and the weight of the system will be against where we are now. And we have weight on our side now. You know, it is a European issue not to have chlorinated chicken. It is a European issue, which, as you know, as we saw with the TTIP treaty, it's a European issue. The people of Europe were very substantially against the weakening of the system that would have destroyed certain public services. So I think there is a danger in there.
But with respect, Mr. Russell, I mean, the UK Trade Minister could not have been clearer in his answer to me. He said, you know, there will be no diminution of food standards, and there's no question of our public services being opened up to international competition. I don't understand why you can't accept him as his word.
Well, I am being absolutely clear with you. I'm not accusing him of lying. I just think that the system, the changes to the system, will immensely weaken our ability to stop those things happening. So you have two divergent points of view. People will have to choose between them.
You still get it as a GPA?
Just in terms of future trade deals, what's your view in terms of devolved administrations being able to opt out in relation to where contracts are involving Scottish public bodies, say for example on something like the living wage?
Well, I think it would be important, and this relates to the issue I raised earlier about the wider context of trade deals. You know, a trade deal, you know, 19th century trade deal is about tariffs. You know, even the early 20th century trade deal is about tariffs. It is about borders. You know, trade deals, 21st century trade deals, are about a wider range of things, and they should be about public protection. They should be about social standards. They should be about environmental standards, and those are things that we should put into them. And that's the type of trade discussions not only we would want to have, but we'd want to influence, you know, the EU to have. And increasingly that is the case. They are also about things like data. I mean, I noticed yesterday a piece of news which said that the last stages of the new EU arrangement with Japan were being put into place, and those stages were the Japanese assuring the EU about the data standards that they had, so that Japanese companies and others could be involved in data processes and data handling. Now, that is about a trade deal. You know, and that's very high standards of regulation that in actual fact protect citizens. So that's extremely important too. And we need to make sure that we are in control of that. And particularly the areas for which we as a parliament and a government are responsible. You know, that is where those things are our responsibility. We should be the people who are making those decisions. I mean, I would have thought that's axiomatic.
Okay, Willie, you wanted to cover TRA still?
Yeah, please. Yeah, thanks very much, Bruce. I don't know if you heard the discussion we had on the TRA with the Minister, and I asked him about representation on that board for any of the devolved administrations, and while I took it, he ruled that out. But I then went on to ask, well, and whoever you appoint to that body, will you assure us that they at least have some experience or knowledge of the devolution, settlement and powers and so on? And he appeared to rule that out as well. So what's your view on that? And does it look that we could have a board of adjudicators that don't know anything about what they're adjudicating on?
Yes, it is. I was disappointed in his response. This remains, you know, an issue in which we are seeking amendment to the bill, along with the Welsh Government, because it's necessary. There is a very easy answer to this, of course, you know, which there is an amendment in place which would solve it. But there's actually practice within public appointments that makes this easy to deal with, which is to ensure that there is, within the person's specification, on that board at least two individuals, one of whom has a substantial knowledge of the Scottish economy and the Scottish trading and Scottish market. Another one has the same knowledge of Wales. You might want one with Northern Ireland as well, depending on what happens in that settlement. That's normal in personal specifications. If you see advertisements for public bodies, you know, there are key specifications from members of public bodies, and that should be applied. So I just can't see the difficulty here. The argument this should be solely on merit seems to imply that the knowledge of Scottish trade in some way would not be as meritorious as having some other qualification. Now, I think the person's specification, at the very least, the person's specification for these appointments should include individuals who are nominated on the grounds that they have this knowledge as well as a wider knowledge. I mean, this is also, you know, common practice for generations. They used to have, I'm sure the convener will remember this, they used to have in the Deer Commission particular categories of membership. One member had to have a knowledge of deer issues in the south of Scotland, and I seem to remember that it was always difficult to appoint to that one. You know, so this is not new. And I really, what I read from the Minister was simply a refusal to accept that they should be thinking about the issues of the Scottish economy, the Welsh economy and the Northern Irish economy.
Is that another example of what you said at the beginning, Cabinet Secretary, about this whole process effectively overturning 19 years of the devolution settlement?
Yes, I think what it's about is a lack of recognition of reality. You know, this is not the country that it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's changed. Devolution changed things, and recognising that change. Now, this is not, you know, you would expect me to say it, but you perhaps wouldn't expect, you know, the PACAC committee to say it in its report. You know, I know that you've met with Bernard Jenkins, and that report makes it clear that that lack of knowledge of devolution is an issue and a problem.
Neil?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. You've written to David Lidington to outline some of your very reasonable concerns about the impact of a no-deal Brexit. There's obviously a great deal of concern about a shortage of goods that could happen as a result of a no-deal Brexit that could hit the UK economy. But I'm interested to know what the specific impact could be on the Scottish economy. Mr Hollingbury said he wasn't in a position to respond to that point, but I know in your letter you have outlined a number of areas in which you have concerns over. What are the specific areas that are, you know, will have a disproportionate effect on Scotland?
There's a number. I mean, there's a legislative burden that this Parliament is going to have to meet. You know, so we are already locked into that. We are going to have to do a considerable amount of additional work between now and next March, and that's simply the reality. I think perhaps of greater importance is the dawning realisation in some sectors that they're also going to have to make exceptional preparations. If you look at the medical side, you know, it has been well publicised that there will have to be a stockpiling of drugs. I think it's extraordinary we're at this stage, but that will have to happen, and there are discussions taking place between Jean Freeman's department and the Department of Health about how that will be handled and exactly what our role will be in that, and that's ongoing. There are issues in food supply, both food supply coming in. I mean, nobody's suggesting there'll be an end to food, but, you know, there is a pinch point at Dover. You know, a great deal of the food supplies we have come here. If there were to be disruption to trade at Dover, then there would be a knock-on effect. And of course, the further you are from Dover, the greater that knock-on effect. There is an issue for businesses, and particularly businesses that are involved in foodstuffs, perishable foodstuffs, going the other way. An example I often use in my own constituency is shellfish. You know, if shellfish is going to France, leaving it on the hard shoulder of the M20 for 3 or 4 days isn't conducive to making it better, put it that way. So there are issues in there. But one of the big issues is we don't know. I mean, I think reasonable people would say every effort will be made to avoid a no deal. But it is being talked up by the UK government, you know, again and again. And some people believe, I was talking to a very senior MEP some time ago about this, some people believe there is a dynamic within the system that once people like the financial sector and others prepare for a no deal, it becomes more likely because people are actually hedging against there being a no deal and making their preparations. So we are locked into an extraordinary set of circumstances. There are things we just don't know, like ports and arrangements at ports. You can make lots of arrangements, but what happens if you suddenly have to put into place a customs inspection and you don't have enough people and enough facilities to put in place a customs inspection? So we will do, as a government, everything we can to do two things. One is to avoid a no deal, because we keep saying this should not happen. But the other one is to make sure that what preparation and protection we can put in place, we will put in place. And that's a job for the whole Parliament. And quite clearly we will work with everybody to try and do so. But it is fair to say I don't think any government will be able to put in place everything that is required, partly because we will not know what everything is required.
Thanks. Okay, I've got a process question at this stage, Cabinet Secretary. The government's already put forward a legislative consent memorandum in regard to the trade bill. And we heard what you said at the beginning of the process in regard to LCMs. Does that mean in these circumstances given that there have been some changes to the bill, that there will be no supplementary legislative consent memorandum from the Scottish Government, and in which case are we expected to rely on the letter which Derek Mackay sent to Liam Fox on the 28th of June as being the position of the Scottish Government? And
it is. I mean, let's not say never. I have proposals that the Scottish Government will want to make to the UK Government about Sewel. I would have hoped, and I have had conversations with the UK Government about Sewel, I would hope that there might be some thinking there that things could change. If that was to change, then the issue of legislative consent would change too. I think the timing of that would be quite crucial. The legislative consent process for this bill has to take its course. But presently, the position that Derek has outlined and the position I have outlined in terms of why we will take these actions is quite clear.
Okay.
Now, I should point out, we recognise, for example, that on secondary legislation for a no-deal option, we require to do certain things, and we will do them. But the Brexit bills themselves are an issue and will remain an issue until we have a sole process that we can rely on.
Okay.
Okay. Can I just? I'm just seeking clarification about this. I mean, I understand why the government has taken the position that it has taken, and I don't want to interrogate that, although we can get into it if you want. I'm just trying to understand. I'm just trying to understand the process. I didn't really understand your answer to the convener's question. Will there be a supplementary legislative consent memorandum for this bill or not?
At the present moment, not. But I'm open at the present moment. I mean, I think that's something that we would want to discuss, and also discuss with you. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not a situation any of us like.
Sure.
And I'm happy to discuss it both with this committee and cross-party, because we've done that before.
Okay. So if the current position is that there probably won't be a supplementary legislative consent memorandum for this bill, do I take it that there won't be a government-sponsored legislative consent motion for this bill?
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Yes.
Yes. So does that mean that Parliament will not have the opportunity to express whether or not it consents to this bill?
Well, as whether or not it consents is in the UK terms irrelevant, because it would be taken as consent anyway. I suppose that would be the case. But I am open to discussion as to whether the Parliament would wish an opportunity to say that it refuses legislative consent. We did that with the Withdrawal Bill. We didn't have to do that with the Withdrawal Bill, but we did it with the Withdrawal Bill. It may well be that the view of many is that we should debate it, in which case I suppose we would then bring a supplementary legislative consent memorandum. But it is fluid at the moment, because there are still the changes to the bill that we've suggested. And I would want to see what happened with those. I'm disappointed by what we've heard from the Trade Minister this morning, but there is still the opportunity for a change of heart. And there's opportunity for a change of heart in the Sewel.
Okay.
Both of those would be helpful.
Okay. And going forward, thinking about future likely Brexit-related bills on, for example, agriculture, is it the government's current position that there won't be a legislative consent memorandum in respect of future Brexit-related legislation?
I don't think it's a hard and fast position. The hard and fast position is that we will not recommend a legislative consent motion on those. But I think we're under an obligation to bring forward our reasoning on that.
Yeah.
So I think we would bring forward our reasoning on it. That would be the normal process. I can't see why we would refuse to do so.
So you would anticipate that there would likely be future legislative consent memorandums on the basis of which committees such as this could take evidence and report.
Yes, if the issue is the committee involvement, yes.
Okay, so it's not a complete withdrawal from the Scottish Government in the entire LCM process.
No, it is. It's a good point, and I think it's useful we clarify it. We're not resiling from the process within this Parliament and the involvement of this Parliament. We are seeking to ensure that this Parliament understands the position the government has taken, and we seek the support of the Parliament in the position that the government has undertaken. But we are not intending to recommend a legislative consent motion on any of the Brexit bills. Is that clear?
Thank you.
Good.
That's very helpful and very clear. Thank you, Minister. We now are moving into private, so I thank our witnesses for their contribution this morning. I'm very grateful.